I remember the day Mark first mentioned the hospital. It wasn't so much a proposal as it was a challenge, a way to break free from the monotony of post-college life. We had all been friends since high school, but after graduation things changed. Everyone had their own plans, their own paths to follow. Some of us had moved on to boring office jobs, others were trying to figure out what to do with their degrees, but none of us were happy. It was late one Saturday evening when Mark showed up at my apartment, his usual grin plastered on his face. He didn't knock, just walked straight in like he owned the place as usual. "You guys are in for the best adventure of your lives," he said without preamble, pacing back and forth like a man possessed. "I found it, the place. It's an old psychiatric hospital, abandoned, and no one's been there in decades." I blinked, my attention immediately caught. "What are you talking about?" "The Greystone Hospital," he said, his voice lowering like he was sharing a forbidden secret. "They say it was the site of some of the most unethical experiments in psychiatric history. Electroshock therapy, lobotomies. The whole place is full of ghosts, man." I laughed, though there was a nervous edge to it. "You really think we should go to some creepy old hospital in the middle of nowhere? Sounds like a terrible idea." Julie, Mark's girlfriend, glanced at him with a skeptical look. She'd always been the practical one in the group, the one who worried about the logistics. "What's so special about this place?" Mark leaned in, excitement bubbling in his eyes. "Because no one's ever dared to spend the night there. And I bet we could be the first. Plus, think about it, it's got everything. History, danger, the thrill of the unknown." He wasn't wrong about the thrill part. Since we'd graduated, life had felt like a long stretch of nothingness. But this was different. "We'd be legends," Mark continued. "People would talk about it for years. The first group of friends to survive the haunted Greystone Hospital." I hesitated, but only for a second. Adventure was something I hadn't felt in a long time. The idea of pushing aside all the stress, the pressure of what came next in life, appealed to me. And it wasn't just Mark's enthusiasm, there was something about the darkness of the place that tugged at my curiosity. "All right," I said. "I'm in." Julie sighed but smiled, already knowing she wouldn't be able to talk us out of it. "You guys are crazy. But fine, count me in." Steve, our resident skeptic, stood with his arms crossed, leaning against the kitchen counter. "You've all lost it. What, we're going to go wander around some old hospital in the middle of nowhere and pretend like it's not dangerous? What's next, a seance?" He looked at Mark, his tone sarcastic, but even he couldn't hide the small spark of curiosity in his eyes. "Fine. I'll go, but only if I get to say I told you so when we get arrested for trespassing." We all laughed, though I could tell that even Steve was starting to get intrigued. Jake, quiet as usual, simply nodded and muttered, "I'm in." And just like that, it was decided. We were going to Greystone. A few days later, we gathered at Mark's place to go over the details. The stories about Greystone Hospital were chilling. Rumors of doctors conducting brutal experiments on patients, using them as human guinea pigs for drugs, electric shock treatments, and even unsanctioned lobotomies. It had been shut down in the 1960s after a scandal involving one of its head psychiatrists. Yet, despite its dark past, the building still stood, abandoned and decaying in the dense woods a few hours outside of town. We pored over old maps Mark had found, tracing the overgrown road that led to the hospital. It seemed like a trek, but nothing too challenging for our group. After all, we were young and free, what could possibly go wrong? It wasn't until we packed our bags and loaded up the car that the reality of the situation began to settle in. The air around us felt heavier, like the weight of the building's long, grim history pressed down on us. The sun was setting as we drove out of the city, the last of the daylight casting an eerie glow over the land as we moved farther from civilization. The closer we got, the more silent the car became. Mark kept glancing at us, his excitement not quite masking the nervous tension in his shoulders. Julie kept checking her phone, but of course there was no signal. The trees grew denser, the road rougher, and the surroundings more desolate. By the time we reached the end of the road, the sun was gone, and we were surrounded by only the dark wilderness. There, looming in front of us like something from a nightmare, was Greystone Hospital. The building was massive, more like a fortress than a hospital. Its crumbling stone walls stretched up into the night sky, the dark windows staring back at us like hollow eyes. The hospital stood in eerie silence, its decayed exterior barely visible against the pitch-black sky. We all stood there for a moment, the sounds of the forest swallowing any noise we made. No one spoke. There was something unsettling about the place, something that didn't quite feel like just an abandoned building. But still, the excitement pulsed through me. This was it. The unknown was waiting inside those walls. And with that, we stepped forward. We had no idea what we were about to unleash. The moment we crossed the threshold into the hospital, the air seemed to change. The dense forest outside, with its crickets and rustling leaves, was replaced by an unnerving silence. The old wooden doors creaked ominously as we pushed them open, the faint smell of rot and mildew hitting us all at once. It was as if the building had been waiting for us, holding its breath until we finally arrived. The entrance hall was vast, the faded tiles on the floor cracked and uneven. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, now warped from years of neglect. It felt like stepping into a place that was frozen in time, like the hospital itself had been abandoned in the middle of a single moment. As if the people who worked here just vanished. Mark, leading the way with his flashlight cutting through the darkness, was giddy. "Look at this place," he said, his voice reverberating against the high ceilings. "We're the first people to walk these halls in decades. This is going to be amazing." I wasn't so sure. My heart was pounding harder with every step. Something about the stillness in the air felt wrong, unnaturally so. I glanced around at my friends, their faces lit by the dim glow of their flashlights, and felt a growing sense of unease. I tried to push it away, telling myself it was just nerves, but something didn't sit right. Julie's voice broke the silence. "Are we sure about this? It's really quiet." "Of course it is," Mark said with a smirk. "It's an abandoned hospital. No one's been here in years. Just a little dust and we'll be fine." Steve scoffed. "Yeah, nothing spooky about that at all," he muttered sarcastically. "What, do you think it's haunted or something?" Before I could respond, a sound echoed down the hallway, soft, almost imperceptible. It sounded like footsteps. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't the only one who heard it. We all froze. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't the creaking of old floors, but a distinct, rhythmic tapping, like someone walking. Mark's flashlight flickered, and for a split second, the beam landed on a door at the end of the hall. The footsteps stopped. "Probably just rats," Steve said, trying to sound casual, but his voice wavered slightly. "This place is falling apart. Nothing to worry about." I nodded but wasn't convinced. There was something about the silence that now felt too perfect, like a predator waiting to pounce. Still, I pushed forward, not wanting to seem like the scared one. We all kept walking, deeper into the hospital's heart. We passed rooms filled with overturned chairs, cracked glass, and old medical equipment rusting away in the corners. The walls were covered with strange, faded photographs of patients and doctors, their faces blurred with time and neglect. Every so often we'd come across strange markings on the walls, handprints, drawings, symbols I couldn't make sense of. One wall even had a section completely covered in scratched-out names and dates, as though someone had tried to erase their very existence. The air felt heavier the deeper we went. It was hard to ignore the fact that the hospital seemed to stretch forever, a maze of twisted hallways and locked doors. We wandered for what felt like hours, and still there was no sign of any way out. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, we came across a door that had been ripped open, the hinges still half attached to the frame. "Guess we're in for a real tour," Mark said, pushing the door open with a little too much enthusiasm. "Look at this place." I stepped inside reluctantly. The room was enormous, filled with rows of empty beds, their metal frames rusted beyond repair. What had once been the heart of the hospital now seemed like a forgotten graveyard for people who had been experimented on, their screams absorbed by the thick walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruding, disturbing the peace of the dead. "Look at these," Julie said, kneeling beside a table where a set of old medical instruments lay untouched, their edges dull and worn. These were used for the treatments, right? The shock therapy and the lobotomies." I shuddered. The thought of the horrors that had taken place here, what kind of experiments they'd done, was enough to make me uneasy. There were papers scattered across the floor too, some barely legible but others were horrifyingly clear. Detailed reports about the patients, their conditions, and the results of the procedures. The further we ventured into the room, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. My skin felt tight, like I was being watched. Suddenly, I noticed a strange symbol scrawled in red on the far wall. It wasn't paint, but something darker, more ominous. The symbol resembled a twisted version of the hospital's logo, but with unnerving lines that seemed to move as I stared at them. I stepped back, almost knocking into Jake, who was too focused on his phone to notice me. "You all right?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah," he muttered, barely looking up. "Just checking the time. But it's weird, my phone keeps flickering. There's no signal, but I swear the battery's draining way faster than it should." I raised an eyebrow. That was strange. None of us had service, of course, but something about his phone acting up felt wrong. Before I could voice my concern, there was a loud bang from the hallway, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Mark, who had been proudly standing in the middle of the room, suddenly went still. His grin faltered. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mark's eyes widened for a fraction of a second. "We should check it out." But as we stood there, waiting for the next sound to confirm what we already knew, I realized no one had moved. No one had heard the footsteps from the other side of the hospital, and no one was coming for us. Then just like that, the lights flickered, and everything went pitch black. The silence that followed the blackout was suffocating. For a long moment, I couldn't even hear the usual hum of the old building, nothing but the deafening sound of my own breath. I fumbled in the dark, trying to find my flashlight. My hands shook more than I wanted to admit. "Mark?" Julie's voice cracked in the stillness. "What's going on?" I could hear Mark moving too, a shuffle of footsteps, and then the flickering sound of his flashlight turning back on. The beam sliced through the darkness, momentarily blinding me before it settled on the nearest wall. "What the hell?" he whispered. "Did you guys hear that?" We all stood in silence, waiting for the sound to repeat itself. It didn't. But the air was different. Heavier, colder. I could almost feel the weight pressing down on us. "All right," Steve muttered, his voice shaky. "This is seriously messed up. Maybe we should just go." "No way," Mark shot back, his voice coming from the darkness just beyond the beam of light. "We've come this far. I'm not bailing now." I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of the situation. The fear in my gut told me to leave, but I couldn't ignore the pull of curiosity. What was that noise? What was that thing? Julie let out a slow breath, clearly trying to gather her thoughts. "We should at least check the rest of the building, right? If we're leaving, but not without exploring every corner of this place." I nodded, though my heart wasn't in it. "I agree. Let's just make it quick. We'll get in and we'll get out. No more wandering around." Mark, though, was already several steps ahead. His flashlight swung around the room, moving to the door we had entered through. It was just a thin sliver of light, but in that moment, the shadows felt like they were closing in on us, tightening their grip. And then, slam. The door we just entered through was suddenly slammed shut. Julie screamed. I heard the distinct sound of a metal latch clinking shut, followed by a steady rattling sound that echoed through the room. It wasn't just the door, the entire building seemed to groan in protest, like it was waking up, stretching out its limbs after years of slumber. I whipped around, feeling panic clawing at my chest. "What the hell?" I shouted, but the words felt small against the growing noise. Mark ran up to the door and tried the handle, only for it to rattle in his hand. "It's locked," he shouted back to us. "What the hell is going on here?" I didn't know what was worse, the door slamming shut on its own, or the fact that Mark had confirmed it was locked from the inside. There was no way anyone else had been here before us. No one had entered or left. I turned to look at my friends, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. We were trapped, but it wasn't just the physical walls around us that were suffocating, it was the feeling of something watching, something waiting. The dread was creeping in. "Let's just get out," Steve said, his voice a little higher than usual. "I mean, it's bad enough that we're in an abandoned hospital, but now the doors are locking themselves?" "We're out of here, Mark." Julie nodded slowly, her face ashen. "I think Steve's right. This isn't funny anymore." Mark stood still, staring at the door with his flashlight held tightly in his hands. He seemed frozen, trying to process everything. "We can't leave now. We're this close. There's something here, I know it." His voice was low, but there was a hint of madness behind it. It wasn't just the thrill of the adventure anymore. It was like he needed to prove something, to himself, to us, to whatever had haunted these halls for years. I felt it too deep down. The weight of it. The pull. "We can't just walk away now," I said, my voice shaking. I hated myself for saying it, but the truth was I was just as curious as Mark. I wanted to know what was happening here, what had caused the door to shut on its own, what those footsteps had been. "We came for this. We need to finish it." Julie gave me a sidelong glance, her lips tight. "You sure about that?" But before anyone could respond, the silence was broken again. A voice. My name. Soft, like a whisper in the back of my mind, but unmistakable. It was as if it was coming from every direction at once, close but so far away. My heart stopped for a moment, my eyes darting around the room. Did anyone else hear that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Someone called my name. They all looked at me, but no one spoke for a moment. Steve's eyes were wide, his hand hovering over the flashlight as if he wasn't sure whether to point it at me or at the dark corners of the room. "You heard that too?" he asked. There was a nervous tremor in his voice, the kind you couldn't fake. Julie's lips parted, but no words came out. Mark, however, was grinning now, his eyes shining. "I told you guys. I told you. This place is alive. This is the real deal." I shook my head, trying to clear the fog. That was not normal. My hands were trembling now, and I wasn't sure if it was from fear or something else. The room felt different. The air had thickened, charged with something I couldn't name. "You're all being paranoid," Mark said, his voice suddenly louder than it had been moments ago. "I heard it too. And I'm telling you, it's real. Let's keep going." There was no going back. We were all far too deep into this now. Maybe it was the fear, maybe it was the thrill of the unknown, but something had changed. A dark thread had woven itself into the very fabric of our group, pulling us further into the hospital, into whatever waited inside. "We keep going," I said, my voice surprisingly firm. "But we stay together. And if anything happens to one of us, we get out." Immediately. The others nodded, though their faces were all shadowed with doubt. But we kept moving. We didn't know it yet, but we had just crossed a line. A point of no return. And the worst was yet to come. The deeper we ventured into Greystone Hospital, the more the walls seemed to close in on us. It was as if the building itself had turned against us, the air growing heavier with each step. We'd passed so many rooms, all of them hauntingly silent, all of them filled with the remnants of a past best left forgotten. But there was one door we hadn't explored yet, one door that had stood out to me since we first arrived. At the end of a long, narrow hallway there was a door. It was different from all the others. This one was sealed tight, marked only by a faded label, Room 7. I'd seen it in the hospital's old blueprints that Mark had found. The others hadn't paid it much attention, but for some reason I couldn't stop thinking about it. When we reached it, I could feel the temperature drop around us as though the room itself was a void, pulling in all warmth and light. "I'm telling you, this is the room," Mark said, his voice filled with awe. His flashlight shook in his hand as he pointed it toward the sealed door. "It's the one they never let anyone near. The one that got shut down after everything went wrong." I stared at the door, my heart pounding in my chest. "What exactly happened here, Mark? You didn't tell us everything about this place." But he wasn't listening. He was too busy trying to pry the door open, pulling at the rusted handle with both hands. At first, nothing happened. Then there was a faint click, followed by the groan of the hinges as the door slowly creaked open. I took a step back, my throat tightening. "Mark, I don't know if we should be doing this." But Mark was already inside, his flashlight beam sweeping across the dusty room. "This is it," he whispered, more to himself than to us. "The forbidden room. The heart of it all." We followed him, though I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just crossed an irreversible line. Inside, the room was much larger than I expected. Old, decaying hospital equipment was scattered across the floor, some of it broken beyond recognition, others covered in a thick layer of dust. A large metal cabinet stood against the far wall, its doors wide open as though inviting us to look inside. There was something about the room that felt off. It wasn't just the eerie silence or the smell of stale air, it was the way the space seemed to bend around us, as if the room itself were alive, watching us, waiting for us to disturb its long slumber. Mark wandered further into the room, his flashlight passing over the old equipment. "This was where they did the worst of it," he said softly, his voice tinged with a kind of fascination. "Electroshock treatments, lobotomies, the stuff they never told anyone about. But there was one thing they never figured out: Room 7 was where they went too far. Whatever they were trying to do, it didn't just affect the patients. It affected the whole damn building." I swallowed hard, my gaze darting to the other friends who had entered the room behind me. I could see the same unease in their eyes, the same feeling that something was wrong, but we couldn't put a finger on what. We had all read the stories about Greystone, but this was real. The chilling realization settled over me like a heavy weight. Julie was the first to break the silence. "What do you mean, Mark? What happened here?" "I don't know," Mark said, now moving toward a large metal table in the center of the room. He ran his hand over it, his fingers brushing against the cold surface. "But whatever it was, they tried to hide it. Keep it quiet. They thought if they locked this place up and never came back, no one would ever find out." As I looked around, something felt wrong, strangely wrong. The air was heavier now, pressing in on us from all sides. I could hear my breath in my ears, feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The room didn't seem as abandoned as it should have been. It felt like something was waiting for us. "Guys," I said, my voice a little shaky, "this place is giving me the creeps. Let's go. We've seen enough." But just as I turned to leave, the temperature in the room plummeted. A sudden chill shot through me, leaving me shivering as I stepped back toward the door. The others seemed to feel it too. Steve was rubbing his arms, his eyes wide. "I don't know, man. Something's up." Julie shot me a worried look. "What is that smell?" The scent was faint at first, something like decaying flesh, mixed with the pungent stench of old hospital disinfectants. Made my stomach churn. Before anyone could respond, the lights flickered, casting long, sharp shadows across the room. We all stopped, looking around in confusion. The flickering grew more intense, faster now, as if the very lights were struggling to stay on. Then for a split second the room changed, it wasn't the same anymore. I blinked and suddenly it wasn't just old equipment and decaying furniture. It was new. The bed frames were clean and white. The walls had no peeling paint, no cracks. I could almost hear the echoes of people moving, talking, the soft shuffle of footsteps on linoleum floors. Then just as quickly the scene snapped back. The room was dark and decayed once again, but I felt like I had just seen something that wasn't supposed to be there. What the hell was that? Jake's voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know," I said, my heart racing. But that wasn't normal. Julie stepped closer to the table, looking down at the metal surface. Her eyes narrowed and she reached out to touch it, but before her fingers made contact, there was a loud bang from the far side of the room. Everyone jumped, spinning around only to find nothing. The room was still. Then the whispers began. Low and soft at first, just barely audible. But they grew louder with each passing second, faint voices calling our names. The sound echoed off the walls, reverberating in my skull like a low hum. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could see that I wasn't the only one who was losing grip on reality. "I heard it too," Steve said, his voice trembling. "Someone's in here with us." Julie looked around, her breathing shallow. "We need to get out. Now." But as we moved toward the door, I noticed something else. The walls seemed to close in on us, the distance between the door and where we were standing stretching impossibly far. It felt like we were walking through thick, suffocating air. "Something's wrong," I whispered. "This isn't just the building. It's inside our heads." I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting something, or someone, to appear in the darkness. But when I looked back at my friends, I realized they weren't standing where they had been before. They were farther back now, further from the door. Farther from me. The door seemed miles away, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Panic set in before I even realized it. We had tried to leave room 7, but the moment we reached the door, everything changed. The hallway that had once been clear was now a maze of twisting, unfamiliar corridors. The dim light from our flashlights flickered as if struggling to hold on, but no matter how far we walked, we couldn't find the exit. Every turn we made led us deeper into the hospital's heart, yet it didn't feel like the same place anymore. The walls felt closer, almost suffocating. The sound of our footsteps echoed too loudly in the now cramped hallways, as if the building was amplifying every noise we made. And the air, it felt heavier with each breath, thick and stale, like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I couldn't shake the sensation that we were no longer just exploring. We were trapped, enclosed, suffocated by the very structure we had once believed was just a ruin. "What the hell is going on?" Julie's voice was barely above a whisper, but it held a note of panic I hadn't heard before. "We just need to go back," Steve said, his voice shaky. His eyes darted around the corridor, searching for any sign of familiarity. "This isn't right. This place isn't normal." Mark, however, was already moving further down the hallway, as though he hadn't heard a word. "No, we're close. I know it. We can't give up now." I stood frozen, watching him, the words hanging in my mind. "We can't give up. We're close? Close to what?" There was nothing here but empty rooms and the oppressive silence that pressed against us like a weight we couldn't escape. The hallway stretched endlessly in front of us, curving and turning, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. I swear we had passed the same rooms over and over again. The doors, the walls, they all seemed different now, as if they had never been the same in the first place. I glanced back down the hallway and froze. We had just passed that door. No, we hadn't. It had moved. The hallway had shifted. The door was in a completely different place now, and we hadn't even noticed. "Guys," my voice faltered as I turned to my friends. "That door wasn't there a second ago." Steve stepped forward, his flashlight shaking as he pointed it at the door. "You're right. I swear we've already passed that." Mark, looking back at us with irritation, waved a hand dismissively. "It's nothing. Just a trick of the mind. We've been in here too long. Let's keep moving." But the building was no longer a place we could just wander through. I could feel it. It was watching us now. It was listening to us. "We're lost," Jake said suddenly, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear him. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. This is wrong. The rooms keep changing. The hallway, it doesn't make sense." "Just keep moving," Mark urged again, his voice sharper now, more desperate. But even his confident facade was starting to crack. His eyes darted nervously around the now cramped, shifting corridor. The others fell silent, each of us becoming increasingly aware of the changes around us. The atmosphere had thickened, but it wasn't just the air, it was the sense that the hospital had come alive, growing, shifting, breathing in its own twisted rhythm. I took a step forward, following the others as we walked deeper into the maze, but everything felt wrong. The ground under my feet felt softer, uneven. The walls pulsed just slightly, like something beneath the surface was shifting. The floorboards creaked, and the lights above us buzzed with an electrical hum that I hadn't noticed before. A low rumble, like distant thunder, seemed to vibrate through the walls as though the hospital was alive. "Mark?" I started, my voice barely a whisper, but my words died in my throat as I looked down the hallway. What had once been a straight corridor now turned sharply at an odd angle, twisting and narrowing as though the walls were closing in on us. The door at the end of the hallway flickered in and out of existence, and I could swear I saw it change, becoming something darker, more sinister. Julie grabbed my arm. "This isn't real. None of this is real." But I didn't respond. I couldn't. Something was pulling at the edges of my mind, a gnawing sense of dread that grew stronger with every passing moment. The more we walked, the more everything seemed to warp around us. Our footsteps echoed louder, and I realized with a sickening twist that it wasn't just the building shifting, it was us. We were the ones changing, becoming part of it. I stopped in my tracks. "Guys," I said again, this time louder. "We're not moving in the same direction. We're walking in circles. The rooms are changing." Steve looked around, his eyes wide. No way. We haven't passed this hall before. We just went down that way. This is wrong." "We're trapped," Jake muttered, his voice hollow. He was looking past me now, his eyes focused on a hallway to our right, one that seemed to be stretching impossibly far. His hands gripped his flashlight so tightly, his knuckles turned white. "Something's wrong. The walls, they're moving." I turned, following his gaze, and felt my stomach drop. The walls were shifting. Literally shifting, groaning like they were alive, as though they had a pulse of their own. The hospital was no longer just a building, it had become a maze that we couldn't escape. The rooms were not just changing, they were becoming something else. They were morphing into places we couldn't recognize, becoming prisons that weren't just built with bricks and stone but with the fear and suffering of those who had come before us. "We need to get out. Now," Julie said urgently, her voice cracking. "We're not alone in here." I looked over at her, my breath caught in my throat. The truth was, I hadn't felt alone for a long time. The entity was with us. It was feeding on our fear, twisting our reality. It wasn't just the walls moving. It was our minds, our very sense of reality, fracturing in ways we couldn't understand. Mark glanced at us, his face pale now, the bravado gone. "We can't leave. We have to find out what's in this place. What happened here?" But his voice shook now, the fear unmistakable. The hospital had become a labyrinth, a place that was no longer just a building but something far more dangerous. It was as if the very walls were trapping us in an inescapable nightmare. No matter how many turns we took, no matter how fast we ran, the hospital was alive, shifting its shape to keep us inside, to keep us from escaping. And then I heard it again, the whispers. Soft at first but growing louder. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the creaking of the old building. It was something else, something darker. It was waiting. And I had no idea how to stop it. It happened suddenly, as though the hospital itself had finally exhaled. The building groaned, the floor beneath our feet shifted, and the air grew colder still, as if it was trying to freeze us in place. We had been walking aimlessly for what felt like hours, but time had stopped making sense. The hospital's hallways had become a labyrinth, twisting and bending around us in ways that defied reason. Every corner we turned, every door we opened, led to another dead end. I wasn't sure how much longer we could keep going. The whispers were louder now, the voices echoing in the corridors, sometimes sounding like loved ones, sometimes like a chorus of strangers. It was as if the walls themselves were speaking, telling us things we didn't want to hear. But it wasn't just the voices that unsettled me. It was the visions. As we walked, the rooms around us seemed to change again, growing darker, more menacing. In some of them we could see figures, shadows of people who didn't belong. The faint, flickering images of patients long dead, their faces twisted in agony. I wanted to look away, but the more I tried to focus on anything else, the stronger the images became. And then it came, something I could no longer deny. The entity revealed itself. It wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. No claws, no fangs, no grotesque creature. It was something far worse, an ancient, intangible force that could shape itself into whatever we feared most. It was in the very air we breathed, in the cold that seemed to seep into our bones. It fed on our fear, using it to twist our minds and manipulate us. The first sign came when the lights flickered and then went out, plunging us into total darkness. I could feel the presence of the entity surrounding us, its energy pressing in on all sides, pushing against our minds, pulling at our thoughts. I tried to speak, but my voice sounded wrong, distant, as if it was being distorted by the air itself. Mark was the first to break. He staggered back, his flashlight in his hand trembling like a leaf in the wind. "What's happening?" he muttered under his breath, his voice unrecognizable. I can't." Julie reached out to steady him. "Mark, what's wrong?" His eyes locked onto hers, but they weren't the same eyes. They were wild, frantic. "You don't understand." He took a step back from her, then another. "It's all your fault. It's all your fault." Julie's face fell, confusion giving way to concern. "Mark, what are you talking about?" "Stop," he shouted, his voice growing hoarse. "Stop pretending. You brought us here. You led us into this. You knew this would happen." "What?" "No, Mark, I didn't," Julie stammered, stepping back as if he had slapped her. But Mark wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were wide, unblinking, filled with something I couldn't place. Fear. It didn't matter. He was unraveling. No, he screamed, his voice echoing off the walls. "You're all lying to me. All of you." "Mark, stop it," Steve shouted, stepping forward. "We're not lying. It is doing this. It's turning us against each other. This isn't us, man." But Mark wasn't hearing it. The entity was feeding off his fear, twisting it into something more monstrous. And it wasn't just him. It was all of us. The hospital, the very air itself, was alive. Alive with fear, alive with the power to break us. I could feel it happening. The darkness was closing in, warping my thoughts, distorting everything I knew. The whispers, the shadows, they all felt like they were becoming real. The next thing I knew, I was seeing things that weren't there. I turned to look at Steve, but for a split second he wasn't Steve anymore. He was something else, something dark, a grotesque, shadowy version of him with wild eyes and a twisted grin. My heart slammed in my chest as I staggered back. "No," I gasped. This is not real." "Isn't it?" The entity's voice boomed in my mind, a deep, guttural growl that made my head ache. "Isn't it?" The hallucinations intensified. I could see everyone's faces distorted, twisted, as if they were not my friends but strangers. Enemies. The entity's power was growing stronger, feeding on our doubts, our suspicions, our growing paranoia. "You need to choose," the voice whispered again. "One of them must pay." I turned, frantic, trying to find something, anything, solid in this madness. But there was nothing. The room around us had transformed into something unrecognizable, its walls pulsing with a sickly glow, its air thick with an unnatural presence. Julie's voice broke through the fog. "This isn't real. None of this is real." But Mark was already advancing, his eyes wild, no longer recognizing any of us. "It's all your fault," he screamed at Julie again. You knew what we were getting into, didn't you? You wanted this. You led us here, you brought us here to die." I reached out, trying to pull him back. "Mark, stop it. You're not yourself." But it was too late. The entity had claimed him. It had driven him mad with fear, and now it was using him as a weapon against us. Julie backed away, her hands shaking. "Mark, I never wanted any of this." Suddenly, Mark lunged at her, his hands grabbing for her throat. "You don't get it. You never will." Everything happened so quickly. Steve jumped forward, pulling Mark away from Julie. The two of them struggled, Mark screaming incoherently, his hands clawing at Steve as if he were a stranger. I grabbed Julie and pulled her behind me. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel the walls closing in on us. We weren't just fighting Mark. We were fighting the very thing that had brought us here. The entity had planted seeds of doubt in our minds, made us see each other as the enemy. We were no longer a group of friends, we were pawns in its game. And now Mark was a threat. "Steve, we have to stop him." I shouted, my voice panicked. But even as I said it, I realized, how? How could we stop him when the hospital itself was working against us? But Steve, to his credit, wasn't backing down. He pinned Mark to the floor, gasping for breath as Mark struggled beneath him, a crazed look in his eyes. "Mark, you've got to fight it. Fight it." The fight didn't last long. Mark's strength was unnatural, his movements jerky and erratic. And when Steve finally managed to knock him out, Mark went limp, his chest heaving as though he were just a man again. But there was no time for relief. The entity hadn't finished with us. The walls started shifting again and the whispers grew louder, closer. We were running out of time. The hospital wasn't just trapping us physically. It was breaking us apart, piece by piece, turning us into something we weren't. And as we stared down at Mark's unconscious form, I realized one terrifying thing. None of us were safe. Time had become a fluid thing. It no longer obeyed the rules we had once known. The hospital's twisted corridors stretched out before us like an endless abyss, mocking our every attempt to find our way out. The further we walked, the further we seemed to be from any kind of escape. How are we still here? Julie's voice was shaking, almost lost in the growing sense of hopelessness that clung to us. We've been walking for hours, days maybe. How are we not out yet? I didn't have an answer for her. All I knew was that every door we tried led us back to the same place. The same cold, oppressive hallway. The same flickering lights. The same distorted walls. At first, we thought it was just our minds playing tricks on us. Fatigue, fear, the growing sense that the walls were closing in. But after the fourth time we'd passed the same door, I knew it wasn't just in our heads. The hospital was changing. It was alive, twisting, warping itself to trap us inside. "We need to split up," Mark muttered, still groggy from his earlier breakdown. His voice was far less confident now, his eyes darting around nervously. "We need to find another way out. This isn't working." "Mark, no. We stay together," Steve said firmly, shaking his head. "Splitting up will only make it worse." But Mark wasn't listening. He was already moving down the hallway, the echoes of his footsteps sending ripples of unease through the group. Julie grabbed my arm. "Do you see it? The walls, they're shifting again." I looked and she was right. The walls seemed to undulate like a breathing thing, pulsing with some unnatural rhythm. The hospital had ceased to be just a building. It was a living entity now, a creature of its own, feeding off the fear it had instilled in us. The door at the end of the hallway stretched impossibly far away as if the very architecture of the hospital was warping, pushing us deeper into its core. I tried to focus, tried to hold on to the sliver of reason that hadn't been consumed yet, but it was slipping away like sand through my fingers. "We need to stay focused," I said, my voice cracking. "We can't let it break us. We need to find a way out. Together." I looked back at the group, seeing their faces, pale, haunted, eyes filled with the terror we'd all been trying to suppress. There was no denying it anymore. The hospital wasn't just a place. It was a trap. And the entity wasn't just manipulating our minds, it was feeding on us. Feeding on our fear, our desperation, and it was using that to bend the world around us. We started to walk again, but the hallway stretched endlessly before us. Every time we took a step, it felt like we were moving backward. The floor creaked beneath us and the walls pressed in closer, tighter. I had to keep looking at my feet to make sure I wasn't losing my balance. But no matter how fast we moved, it didn't help. The hospital had us trapped in its endless maze. "I swear we've passed this door 3 times already," Steve said, his voice shaky now. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. His shoulders were hunched in defeat. "This doesn't make sense. We're going in circles." Julie's breath hitched. "We are, aren't we? This place, it's alive. It's changing the halls. It's moving us where it wants us to go." I wanted to argue, but I couldn't. There was something in the air now, a low hum that buzzed against my skull, like the whole building was aware of us, watching us, controlling us. I wanted to scream, to tear at the walls, but the words caught in my throat. "Shut up," Mark suddenly shouted, his voice raw. He slammed his hand against the wall in frustration, his knuckles white. "Shut up, all of you. This is your fault. This is because you couldn't just leave it alone. We deserve this." He spun around, glaring at Julie and then at Steve. His expression twisted with fear, but there was something else there too, something darker. Something that wasn't his. The entity was doing this. It was using him against us, making us turn on each other, warping our fears until we couldn't tell what was real anymore. "We have to stop it," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We have to stop this before it breaks us completely." But Mark wasn't listening. His eyes were glazed over, his body tense. "You'll never leave. None of you will." I rushed forward, grabbing his arm. "Mark, no. This isn't you. It's the hospital. It's them. It's controlling you. His head snapped toward me, his eyes wide with terror. "It's you," he hissed, his voice low, distorted. "You brought us here. You're the one who—" The words cut off abruptly as he collapsed to his knees. He grabbed his head, shaking violently, as if something inside him was trying to escape. His body jerked, his mouth open in a silent scream. Julie and Steve moved quickly to help, but it was too late. Mark's face twisted in agony, his hands gripping his skull as if he could hold the entity at bay. And then, with a final horrifying twist of his body, he let out a scream that sent chills down my spine. And just like that, he stopped moving. We stood in the silence that followed, hearts pounding, fear creeping into every corner of our minds. What had just happened? Was he gone? "Mark!" Julie screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. But there was no response. His body was cold, his eyes wide and empty. I backed away from him, my mind racing, the gravity of what had just happened settling in. The entity had claimed him. We were losing him one by one. And now we were alone, trapped. The door at the end of the hallway flickered in and out of view, and I knew there was no escape. The hospital had no intention of letting us go. It wasn't just a building. It was a prison, and the walls were closing in. "Please," I whispered, my voice cracking. "We need to get out. We need to get out now." But I didn't have an answer. There was no way out. We were all lost. And the worst part? The entity was feeding on our desperation. The air felt thick, suffocating, like the walls were closing in on us, pressing against our chests, pushing us into a corner we couldn't escape. The hospital, once just a place of decay and ruin, had become something much darker, much more alive. The entity had fed off our fear, our paranoia, our pain, and now it was ready for its final feast. We stood in the center of the hallway, huddled together, our breaths shallow, the weight of what was coming hanging over us like a dark cloud. The walls pulsed and groaned around us, and the hum in the air grew louder. It was like the building was alive, breathing, suffocating us. Mark's lifeless body lay sprawled on the floor behind us. The entity had claimed him, and we knew it wouldn't stop there. It wanted more. It wanted us all. "Why are we still here?" Steve whispered, his voice hoarse, a deep fear threading through his words. "It's too late. It's too late for any of us. We're just feeding it now." Julie's hands trembled at her sides. "There has to be a way out. There has to be." But her voice trailed off, the hopelessness sinking in. We had tried every door, every hallway, and yet they all led to the same place. Deeper into the heart of the hospital, deeper into the grip of the entity that was twisting everything around us. I didn't know how long we had been walking, but the exhaustion was starting to take its toll. Every step felt heavier. Every corner turned felt like we were being pulled further from the world we knew. I could feel the weight of someone, watching us, looming over us. It wasn't just the entity. It was the hospital itself, alive with hunger, its energy feeding off our desperation, our fear. "What do we do?" Julie asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and frustration. She turned toward me, her eyes wide with terror. "What do we do now?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. I had no more answers. The entity had taken everything from us. Our peace, our sanity, our safety, and now it was demanding something more. Something worse. As if on cue, the air around us shifted again. The hospital groaned, louder this time, shaking as though it were on the verge of collapse. But it wasn't the structure that was collapsing. It was us. The entity had reached its peak. It had broken us down, twisted our minds until we no longer knew where we ended and it began. And then the voice came again. One must be given. One must be taken. It was deep and guttural, echoing in our minds. It was the entity speaking, commanding, demanding. "What does it want from us?" Steve asked, his voice barely audible. He looked at me, but there was no hope left in his eyes, only fear. "What are we supposed to do?" The voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't just in our minds. It was all around us. In the walls, in the very air we breathed. One must be chosen. One must be sacrificed. You will decide who. It was then that I realized what the entity was offering, or rather what it was forcing us to do. It had broken us down so thoroughly that it was now playing its final game. One of us had to die. One of us had to be sacrificed to it, or we would all be trapped here forever. I felt a cold sweat break out across my back as the weight of the decision settled on me. No, we couldn't. We couldn't choose one of us to die. Not after everything we had already been through. But the entity's presence was suffocating. Its power was overwhelming. It wanted us to break, to fracture completely, and it was going to make us make the impossible choice. Julie stood next to me, her eyes filled with horror. She looked at Steve, then at me, and for the briefest moment I saw the truth in her eyes. She knew, just as I did, that there was no way out unless we gave it what it wanted. One of us had to go. But who? Please, Julie whispered, her voice breaking. Please don't let it be me. Steve turned toward her, his expression twisted with agony. He looked at me, his eyes pleading. I can't do it. Not after everything. I stepped back, my mind racing. There had to be another way. There had to be a way to outsmart it. And then it hit me. I didn't know how long I had been holding onto the flashlight, but as I looked at it, something clicked. I remembered something from earlier, when we first entered the hospital. Mark had mentioned something about the hospital's past. It wasn't just the place that was haunted, it was the experiments. The entity had been created from the suffering of the patients who had undergone terrible, inhumane treatments. The entity had grown powerful because of their fear, their pain. But what if we could reverse it? I didn't have much time to think. I had to act fast. Listen to me. I shouted, my voice louder than I intended. We can fight this. The entity, it feeds off fear, right? It wants us to give in. It wants us to give up. But if we stand together, if we don't let it tear us apart, we might be able to break free. Julie and Steve exchanged a glance, their expressions filled with doubt, but they were willing to listen. The room around us pulsed with an unnatural energy, but I refused to back down. I'm not giving it what it wants, I said, my voice steady despite the fear threatening to choke me. None of us are. If one of us dies, we all die. We have to fight back. Julie nodded slowly. Steve hesitated, then took a deep breath and clenched his fists. We were going to do this. We were going to escape together. In the next instant, everything changed. The walls trembled violently as if the hospital was angry. The floor cracked and the hospital's grip on us tightened, but we didn't flinch. We held our ground. Then, in a final burst of energy, we ran. We didn't know how or why, but the walls gave way. The doors opened. They let us go. As we stumbled into the open, the hospital's dark grip on us released, but not without one last sacrifice. In the final moments, Steve was pulled back into the darkness. We heard his scream as we rushed toward the exit, but we couldn't go back. We were free and yet, we weren't. We made it out. But as we stood outside, gasping for breath, the horrors of the hospital seemed to follow us. The trauma, the nightmares, it would never leave us. The hospital's curse had been broken, but its memory would linger, haunting us for the rest of our lives. And the worst part? We knew deep down that it wasn't over. Not really. Because the hospital's horrors weren't just in the walls. They were in us.